must commit all forces to this sector immediately. Sir, intelligence reports heavy resistance here. We have to move now, Admiral.
They knew. That's the part that haunts me most. Not that they were defeated. Defeat comes to every empire eventually, not that their men died by the hundreds of thousands. War has always consumed men like fuel. What haunts me is that Japan's highest naval commanders knew, with cold mathematical certainty, that they had already lost the war. They knew it before most of their sailors had even loaded their first shell. They knew it in the smoke and wreckage of a harbor in Hawaii, in the silence of an empty chart room, in the careful columns of production estimate that no one was allowed to see. They knew, and they said nothing. They smiled at ceremonies. They signed orders. They sent boys to die on islands whose names they couldn't pronounce, for objectives they privately knew were impossible, in service of strategy they understood to be a fantasy. And the reason they stayed silent, the reason they swallowed that knowledge and buried it under layers of duty and shame and institutional terror, tells you something so dark about the nature of power, about the machinery of war, about the gulf between what leaders know and what they say, that it will stay with you long after you finish watching this. If you're new here, this channel exists to drag history out of the textbook and back into the human chest where it belongs. We don't do dates and timelines. We do the interior life of catastrophe. Hit subscribe and stay with me, because we're going deep tonight. The story begins not in December 1941, but in the months and years before. Because to understand what Japan's admirals knew, and when they knew it, you have to understand the strange, almost schizophrenic world they inhabited. These were men of extraordinary intelligence operating inside an institution of extraordinary denial. They were products of one of the most rigorous naval education systems on Earth, trained in mathematics, logistics, strategy, and foreign languages. Many of them had studied in the United States or in Europe. Many spoke English fluently. They had read American naval doctrine. They subscribed to Jane's fighting ships. They attended international naval conferences. They knew the tonnage of every warship in the Pacific Fleet, not from intelligence estimates, but from the open public record that every major navy maintained. And they knew with the precision of engineers what it would take to defeat the country that built those ships. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku is the name history remembers as the architect of Pearl Harbor, and he deserves that designation. But what history tends to omit is what Yamamoto actually thought about the war he was about to start. He had spent 2 separate tours as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C. The first was from 1926 to 1928. The second was from 1925, and then again around 1926. He had crossed the continental United States by train, sitting in a passenger car and watching the landscape unspool for days. The factories of Pennsylvania and Ohio, the steel mills of Pittsburgh pouring orange fire into the night sky, the freight yards of Chicago clogged with cattle cars and coal hoppers and flat cars loaded with machinery, the oil fields of Texas and Oklahoma, where the derricks ran to the horizon, the automobile plants of Detroit, where men in overalls assembled machines at a pace that would have seemed fantastical to any society that had not built the infrastructure to support it. He understood America not as an abstraction but as a physical reality, and what he understood terrified him. In 1940, when the Japanese government was moving toward a tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, Yamamoto wrote a private letter to a political ally warning against war with the United States in terms so stark they read like prophecy. He wrote that if forced into a conflict, he could guarantee running wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. But after that, he wrote, I have no expectation of success. He was not being falsely modest. He was not performing the ritual humility that Japanese culture sometimes demanded of its leaders. He was doing what he did with everything in his life, calculating the variables, running the numbers, arriving at a conclusion, and stating it plainly. The conclusion was this: Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. The industrial gap was simply too large. He was not alone in this assessment, though he was probably its most prominent and most clear-headed adherent. Other senior naval officers had conducted similar analyses and arrived at similar conclusions. Some had expressed these views in private correspondence. Some had voiced them in restricted internal discussions. A few had even committed them to formal memoranda that circulated within the naval hierarchy. But these voices existed in tension with a much louder current within the institution, the current of aggressive optimism, of strategic impatience, of a national ideology that told the Japanese military it was fighting not just a material war, but a spiritual one, and that spiritual superiority could compensate for industrial inferiority in ways that arithmetic could not capture. This was the current that pulled the institution toward war, and it was, by 1940 and 1941, far stronger than the current that counseled caution. To understand why that gap was so decisive, you need to understand what modern naval warfare actually required. Not courage, not tradition, not the spiritual ferocity that Japanese military ideology called Yamato Damashii. The soul of Japan, what it required was steel and aluminum and aviation fuel and machine tools and copper wire and rubber and trained mechanics and metallurgists and aeronautical engineers, and the factories to produce all of it in quantities that could sustain continuous combat across thousands of miles of ocean, replacing losses as fast as they occurred. By the late 1930s, the United States was producing approximately 8 times the steel that Japan produced annually. American oil production was something like 50 times Japan's domestic output. American aluminum production, critical for aircraft construction, dwarfed Japan's by a comparable margin. American machine tool production was so far ahead that it existed in a different industrial universe entirely. These were not secrets. These were published figures, available in any good library in Tokyo, in any serious economic journal, in the annual statistical abstracts that every major industrial nation published. Japanese naval planners had run the numbers. They had what they call the basic war plan studies, elaborate strategic analyses conducted by the Naval General Staff that attempted to model the outcome of a Pacific war against the United States across various scenarios and timeframes. The conclusions of these studies, which were classified at the highest level but were known in summary form to the senior admirals, were not encouraging. The studies showed that Japan could sustain offensive operations for approximately 18 months, possibly 2 years under optimistic assumptions about fuel consumption and battle losses. After that, without a decisive early victory that forced American political will to collapse, a voluntary American decision to negotiate rather than fight, the industrial imbalance would grind Japan down with the same inexorability as a geological process. The ships could not be replaced fast enough. The aircraft could not be produced fast enough. The trained men, the pilots and the maintenance crews and the engineers and the fire control specialists could not be replaced fast enough. The oil, which Japan was almost entirely dependent on foreign sources for, would eventually run out regardless of what territory Japan seized. The mathematics, examined honestly, did not produce a path to victory. That last point about oil deserves a moment of attention on its own, because it is often treated as a footnote when it was actually a central driver of the entire war. Japan in 1941 was importing approximately 80% of its oil, and the great bulk of that was coming from the United States and from the Dutch East Indies. When the Roosevelt administration imposed an oil embargo on Japan following Japan's expansion into Indochina in July 1941, the calculus for Japanese planners became brutally simple. Either Japan withdrew from China and Indochina, accepting a strategic humiliation after a decade of sacrifice and a decade of propaganda telling the Japanese public that the China War was a just and winnable crusade, or Japan seized the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies by force, which meant war with Britain and the Netherlands, and almost certainly with the United States. The third option, finding a diplomatic accommodation that satisfied American concerns while preserving enough of Japan's position in China to be politically viable in Tokyo, was pursued half-heartedly in the late months of 1941, and was probably never genuinely possible given the distance between American and Japanese minimum positions. The embargo left Japan with approximately 18 months of oil reserves. The clock was running. The choice was withdrawal or war. And the choice of war meant the choice of the strategy that Yamamoto had been pressed to design, the strategy of the decisive opening blow. That last point about oil deserves a moment of attention on its own, because it is often treated as a footnote when it was actually a central driver of the entire war. Japan in 1941 was importing approximately 80% of its oil, and the great bulk of that was coming from the United States and from the Dutch East Indies. When the Roosevelt administration imposed an oil embargo on Japan following Japan's expansion into Indochina in July 1941, the calculus for Japanese planners became brutally simple. Either Japan withdrew from China and Indochina, accepting a strategic humiliation after a decade of sacrifice and a decade of propaganda telling the Japanese public that the China War was a just and winnable crusade, or Japan seized the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies by force, which meant war with Britain and the Netherlands, and almost certainly with the United States. The third option, finding a diplomatic accommodation that satisfied American concerns while preserving enough of Japan's position in China to be politically viable in Tokyo, was pursued half-heartedly in the late months of 1941, and was probably never genuinely possible given the distance between American and Japanese minimum positions. The embargo left Japan with approximately 18 months of oil reserves. The clock was running. The choice was withdrawal or war. The pilot question is the one that breaks my heart every time I think about it, because it illustrates the mechanism of the silence more precisely than anything else. Japan's naval aviators in 1941 were, by virtually all accounts, the finest in the world. The pilots who flew the attack on Pearl Harbor had hundreds of hours in their logbooks. Many of them had combat experience over China. They could fly at night, in bad weather, at low altitude, through anti-aircraft fire, and still hit their targets with precision that no other air force could consistently match. The men who sank 4C, who swept through the skies over Malaya and the Dutch East Indies and Ceylon. These were men who had been forged by years of the most demanding training any military aviation program had ever devised. Japanese flight training was a crucible that broke most of the men who entered it and produced, from those who survived, something close to the perfect military pilot. But the program produced them slowly, very slowly. The standards that created their extraordinary skill also limited the throughput to a relatively small number of graduates per year. This was a deliberate choice rooted in an assumption that wars would be decided quickly, that the small pool of exceptional pilots who would fly the opening campaigns would be sufficient to achieve victory before the need for replacements became critical. The program was designed for quality, not quantity. It was designed for a short war. American pilot training was the opposite in almost every way. It was industrial. It was designed not to produce the greatest individual aviators, though some of those emerged from it, but to produce adequate aviators in enormous quantities. Where Japan trained hundreds per year, America trained tens of thousands. Where Japan took 2 or 3 years to move a recruit from enlistment to combat-ready status, America's wartime training pipeline was compressed to months. The training methods were different. The aircraft used were different. The standards applied were different in ways that produced individual pilots of somewhat lower initial quality, but in numbers so vast that the quality difference was irrelevant to the aggregate combat power. This asymmetry was known to Japanese planners. They had studied American training methods. They understood that if the war extended long enough for American training to generate its full output, Japan's qualitative edge would be swamped by American numerical superiority. The question was not whether this would happen. The question was whether the war could be won before it happened. And the men who designed the war plan, the men who approved it, knew or should have known that the answer was almost certainly no. The attack on Pearl Harbor was executed on December 7, 1941, with a precision and effectiveness that its planners could not entirely have anticipated. 6 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 28 submarines, and a host of support vessels had crossed thousands of miles of ocean in strict radio silence, maintaining communications discipline that the Japanese Navy had never before attempted on this scale. The weather across the North Pacific in late November and early December was terrible. Storm-tossed seas, thick clouds, cold that made aircraft maintenance a misery. The ships maintained formation anyway. The strike force arrived at its launch point 275 miles north of Oahu, precisely on schedule and in precisely the right position. The first wave of 183 aircraft lifted off the carrier decks before dawn. The second wave of 167 aircraft followed. In roughly 90 minutes of attack, The aircraft sank or seriously damaged 8 battleships of the United States Pacific Fleet, damaged or destroyed 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, an anti-aircraft training ship, and a mine layer. They destroyed or damaged 328 American aircraft, most of them on the ground. They killed 2,403 Americans and wounded 1,178 more. Japanese losses were 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines that had attempted to penetrate the harbor before the air attack, and 64 men. By every conventional measure of a surprise attack, it was a spectacular success. By the standards of the military operational art, it was a masterpiece. And Yamamoto, watching the first reports coming by radio from his flagship, the battleship Nagato anchored in Hiroshima Bay, reportedly said nothing for a long time. His staff celebrated around him. There was a barely contained joy, the relief of tension, of men who had executed a nearly perfect operation and were now receiving confirmation that it had worked. The officers around him were smiling, some of them struggling to maintain military composure against a desire to cheer. And Yamamoto sat in his chair and was quiet. And he was not thinking about what was in the harbor. He was thinking about what was not. The American aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The USS Enterprise was at sea, returned to Pearl from a mission delivering aircraft to Wake Island. The USS Lexington was on a similar mission toward Midway. The USS Saratoga was on the west coast of the continental United States, undergoing a refit at Puget Sound. The USS Yorktown was in the Atlantic, not yet transferred to Pacific. 3 of the 4 American Pacific Fleet carriers were at sea and would remain operational. The 4th was thousands of miles away. The strike force that had sailed 6 carriers across the North Pacific to deliver the decisive blow had missed the ships that would determine the war's outcome. Japanese planners had known there was a possibility the carriers would not be present. The intelligence work before the operation had tracked the carriers' movements as best it could, but American carrier operations in the weeks before the attack had taken the ships out of Pearl Harbor in ways that Japanese planners could not entirely predict or control. The plan had been designed on the assumption that the carriers would probably be there, or at least that destroying the battleships and the shore installations would be sufficiently crippling to achieve the strategic objective. But Yamamoto understood aircraft carriers in a way that many of his contemporaries did not. He had argued within the Japanese Navy for the centrality of carrier aviation for years against institutional resistance from the battleship admirals who dominated the naval general staff. He had won that argument well enough to get 6 carriers committed to the Pearl Harbor operation. And now the carriers he had feared most were alive and free and would come back. The fuel tank farms at Pearl Harbor had also survived intact. This was an oversight in the Japanese attack planning that Yamamoto's own staff later acknowledged as one of the operation's most consequential failures. The oil storage facilities at Pearl Harbor held roughly 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil, aviation gasoline, and diesel, enough to sustain the Pacific Fleet's operations for months and enough that, if destroyed, would have denied the fleet its logistical base in Hawaii and potentially forced it to withdraw to the west coast. But the first and second wave attack plans had prioritized ships, airfields, and aircraft. The tanks were not a primary target. The pilots who might have extended their attacks to the tank farm were under orders to strike their primary objectives. The tanks survived. And because the tanks survived, the Pacific Fleet could continue to operate from Hawaii rather than being forced back 2,000 miles to San Diego or Puget Sound. The strategic radius of American power in the Pacific remained anchored on Pearl Harbor. The attack that was supposed to drive America out of the Central Pacific had instead left the entire Pacific Fleet logistics system intact. None of this was hidden from Japanese intelligence. The post-attack photo reconnaissance showed the fuel tanks clearly. The Japanese Naval Intelligence Network, operating through embassy channels in neutral countries and through the analysis of open-source American communications, reported on the recovery efforts underway. The repair crews working around the clock at Pearl Harbor were doing their work in a harbor so shallow. The deepest point where the stricken ships had settled was only about 35 feet, that many of the ships could be raised, repaired, and returned to service. Within a year, 6 of the 8 battleships that had been sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor were operational again. The flagship of the attack, the USS Arizona, was a total loss, as was the Oklahoma. But Nevada, California, West Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, Pennsylvania all came back. The attack that was supposed to cripple the American Pacific Fleet for years had crippled it for months. The days and weeks after Pearl Harbor were, on the surface, a period of almost inconceivable Japanese triumph. The British 4C, the modern battleship Prince of Wales, and the battlecruiser Repulse, the two largest and most powerful British warships in the Far East, dispatched to Singapore with great fanfare as a demonstration of British resolve, was located by Japanese naval aircraft on December 10th, just 72 hours after Pearl Harbor, and sunk while underway and under full power. The Prince of Wales went down in about 90 minutes. The Repulse lasted only slightly longer. 840 British sailors died with them. It was the first time in history that capital ships underway and under their own power, with freedom to maneuver and the ability to defend themselves, had been sunk solely by aircraft. There were no other ships involved, no submarines, no surface action, just bombers and torpedo planes. The event sent a shockwave through every naval establishment on Earth and confirmed what carrier aviation advocates like Yamamoto had always argued. The era of the battleship as a decisive weapon of naval warfare was over. Then came the systematic dismantling of the American and British position in the Pacific and the Far East. Guam fell to Japanese forces 2 days after Pearl Harbor. Wake Island, after a remarkable and heroic defense that repulsed an initial Japanese landing attempt and inflicted the first real check on Japanese expansion, finally fell on December 23rd. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day 1941. The British garrison surrendering after a siege of just over 2 weeks. Manila was declared an open city on December 26 and fell to Japanese forces on January 2nd, 1942. The American and Filipino defenders under General MacArthur withdrew to the Bataan Peninsula, where they would hold out until April in one of the most brutal land campaigns of the Pacific War, before surrendering under the terms of a capitulation that produced the horror of the Bataan Death March. Singapore fell on February 15, 1942. The supposedly impregnable fortress of the British Empire in Southeast Asia, protected by enormous shore guns pointed out to sea, was attacked from the jungle to the north by Japanese forces who had swept down the Malay Peninsula in 65 days on bicycles. Literally bicycles, commandeered from civilians and ridden along roads and jungle tracks, while the British defenders, expecting the attack to come from the sea, kept their guns pointed in the wrong direction. 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendered to a Japanese force of approximately 30,000 men in what Churchill called the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The Dutch East Indies fell in March. Burma fell over the course of several months of brutal fighting. The Japanese carrier force raided Ceylon in April 1942, sinking 2 British heavy cruisers and a carrier in open sea in what was a high water mark of Japanese naval power's geographic reach. The Japanese perimeter, as of the spring of 1942, extended from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the border of India in the west, from Burma in the northwest to the Solomon Islands in the south. It was the largest empire ever assembled in such a short time. It encompassed some of the most resource-rich territory on Earth. It had been seized against opponents who were, in many cases, caught flat-footed and outmatched, and in the corridors of the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, in the operations rooms of the combined fleet. The men who understood what they were looking at were quietly doing arithmetic that the celebrations around them could not silence. Here is the arithmetic they were doing. Japan had seized enormous territory, yes, but holding territory in a modern war requires logistics, the ability to supply the forces defending it with fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, medical supplies. Every island Japan added to its perimeter was another island that needed to be connected to the supply chain. Every garrison needed to be shipped its provisions. Every airfield needed aviation fuel transported to it by tanker. Every damaged ship needed to return to a dry dock that had capacity and the skilled workers to repair it. The Japanese logistics system, which had been built for the original defensive perimeter Japan had planned before the war, was now being stretched across an area roughly 3 times as large. The strain was not immediately visible in the victories of the first 6 months, but it was there, accumulating quietly in the ledgers of supply bureaus. And there was another kind of arithmetic being done, more quietly, in offices that even the Naval General Staff did not have full access to. The industrial assessment offices within the planning apparatus were tracking the comparative production numbers. They were watching American shipyard output begin to climb, slowly at first, and then with gathering momentum, as the industrial capacity of the United States shifted onto a war footing. They were watching American aircraft production totals increase month by month. They were watching the training numbers, the number of American pilots completing training, the number of crews qualifying on new aircraft types, and they were tracking, with growing unease, the gap between what they were seeing in these numbers and what was being said in the strategy meetings. The Naval General Staff in this period was a place of extraordinary cognitive dissonance. The men who ran it were receiving intelligence that pointed unambiguously in one direction, while operating within an institutional culture that required them to plan as if that intelligence did not exist. They held strategy sessions in which the assumption of Japanese military superiority was taken as given, in which the decisive battle against the American fleet was discussed as a matter of when, not whether. They approved operational plans that were built on premises their own intelligence analysis contradicted. They did this not because they were stupid. These were among the most technically capable naval officers Japan had ever produced, but because the system they inhabited had made honesty about the strategic situation into something that felt institutionally like treason. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 was the first real check on Japanese offensive operations, and it illuminated several of the structural weaknesses that would eventually destroy Japan's naval power, for those who were willing to see them. The battle was fought entirely by aircraft from opposing carrier forces. Neither fleet ever came within sight of the other's surface ships, making it the first naval battle in history, conducted entirely by aircraft. Japan was attempting to complete the capture of Port Moresby in New Guinea, which would have provided a base for attacks on northern Australia and potentially for isolating Australia from the United States. American codebreakers had warned of the operation. American carriers were positioned to intercept. The battle's outcome was ambiguous in tactical terms. Japan sank the American fleet carrier Lexington and damaged Yorktown, while American aircraft sank the Japanese light carrier Shoho and damaged the fleet carrier Shokaku. In terms of ships sunk, Japan had a slight advantage. The battle could be and was declared a Japanese victory in Tokyo, but the strategic result was that Japan had failed to capture Port Moresby, and the operational result was that the Japanese carrier air groups had suffered severe losses. The Shokaku's air group was badly damaged. The Zuikaku's air group, on a ship that survived the battle undamaged, had nevertheless lost so many experienced pilots that the ship could not be considered combat ready. Two of Japan's 6 fleet carriers were effectively unavailable for the next operation, and the American carriers had demonstrated that they could fight the Japanese to something close to a draw even in 1942, when the Japanese qualitative advantage was at its maximum. In the Naval General Staff, the result of the Coral Sea was processed through the standard filters. The victories were emphasized. The losses were acknowledged but contextualized as acceptable in exchange for the damage inflicted on the Americans. The question that no one asked in any official meeting, though perhaps some asked themselves alone in their offices at night, was this: if Japan's carrier forces suffered equivalent losses in every major operation, how long before the replacement problem became unsolvable? The question of what the Naval General Staff knew about American capabilities reached its critical point in the lead-up to the Midway operation, which was scheduled for June 1942. The plan called for Japan to seize the Midway Atoll, which sat in the Central Pacific approximately 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu, and to use this seizure as bait for the decisive fleet engagement that Yamamoto had wanted from the beginning. The theory was that the Americans would have to defend Midway because of its proximity to Hawaii, and that in defending it, the American carriers would be drawn into a battle against a Japanese carrier force that outnumbered them. Japan was committing 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with the most experienced carrier air groups in the world. The Americans had at best 3 carriers, 2 of which had been present at Coral Sea and might not have been fully repaired. The odds favored Japan, on paper. What the Japanese planners could not know, what their code security had fatally failed to prevent, was that the American codebreakers at station HYPO in Pearl Harbor had been reading Japanese naval communications with enough success to know the basic outline of the Midway plan. The code breakers, led by Commander Joseph Rockefeller, working in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters in conditions of extraordinary secrecy and under extraordinary time pressure, had broken enough of the Japanese operational code to determine that a major offensive toward a location designated in Japanese communications as AF was being planned. They strongly suspected AF was Midway. To confirm it, they arranged for Midway to send a radio message in the clear, complaining about problems with the island's water distillation plant. Within days, Japanese communications reported that AF was having water problems. Midway was AF. The operation was real. The target was confirmed, and the Americans knew it was coming. The USS Yorktown, seriously damaged at Coral Sea and given a repair estimate of 90 days by the peacetime standards that the naval repair facilities have been operating under, was rushed into dry dock at Pearl Harbor. 1,400 workers worked continuously, in shifts without rest, for 72 hours. The Yorktown sailed from Midway still leaking oil from a compartment that had not been fully sealed. She was not in ideal condition, but she was operational. She was armed. She would fight. The battle's decisive moment lasted approximately 6 minutes on the morning of June 4th, 1942. The exact sequence of events in those 6 minutes has been studied exhaustively, and I won't reconstruct it in tactical detail here. What matters for this story is the context and the consequence. 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were hit by American dive bombers within minutes of each other. All 3 were on fire within an hour. All 3 were abandoned and eventually sunk. The Hiryu, which had escaped the first American attack, launched 2 counterattack strikes that hit Yorktown badly enough that she had to be abandoned. But late that same afternoon, dive bombers from the Enterprise found Hiryu and hit her with 4 bombs. She burned through the night and was scuttled the following morning. In 1 day of combat, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 4 fleet carriers, the 4 ships that had formed the core of the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, the 4 ships that carried the best-trained carrier air groups in the world. Approximately 3,057 Japanese naval personnel were killed. The loss of Akagi alone meant the death of one of Japan's most experienced carrier commanding officers, Rear Admiral Ryanosuke Kasuka's air staff, and the air group that led the Pearl Harbor attack, the attack on Ceylon, the attack on Darwin. These were men who could not be replicated. The replacements who would take their places were younger, less experienced, and were already waiting in training units for assignments that now came to them faster than anyone had planned. American losses were significant. Yorktown was sunk by a Japanese submarine while under tow on June 7th, along with the destroyer Hammond. 307 Americans died, but America had lost 1 carrier. Japan had lost 4. And industrial arithmetic, the arithmetic that had been suppressed in Tokyo's planning offices, now spoke with the clarity of burning ships. Yamamoto, aboard his flagship Yamato far from the battle, received the reports throughout the day. His behavior in those hours is reported differently by different witnesses, but several accounts agree on the essential quality. He was quiet, and he was controlled, and whatever was happening inside him was not visible on his face. When the full scope of the disaster became clear, all 4 carriers gone, no decisive fleet action, the Americans intact, and the surviving Japanese forces retreating northwest, he canceled the operation. He ordered the fleet to turn back. He went to his cabin. Some accounts say he did not eat that evening. Some say he spent hours alone. What he is not reported to have said to anyone is that this was the end, that the war had now become unwinnable beyond any realistic calculation. He knew it. His staff, the men closest to him, knew it. No one said it. What happened next is the part of the story that I find most difficult to sit with, because it was a choice, not the chaos of combat, not the fog of war, not the decisions made under fire with incomplete information. This was a deliberate institutional choice, made in conditions of relative calm, by men who knew exactly what they were doing. The disaster at Midway was not reported to the Japanese public. The survivors of the 4 sunken carriers, thousands of men, including some of the most experienced naval aviators in the world, were transferred to ships and brought back to Japan. They were isolated from the civilian population. They were forbidden from communicating with family members about what had happened or where they had been. They were billeted in remote naval facilities. Mail from their families that mentioned the battle or the carriers was intercepted. The men were not told when or whether they would be released to contact their families. They lived for months in a kind of enforced informational quarantine, carrying knowledge of what had happened while the country around them was told, in official communiques, that Midway had been a great Japanese victory. The newspapers printed the victory reports. The radio played appropriate music. The emperor was given an account of events that bore a highly processed relationship to what had actually happened. At the operational planning level, the lie was even more sophisticated, because it had to be, because the planning process could not function without some accurate information about available forces. The Naval General Staff was informed of the true losses, eventually, in pieces and over weeks, because there was no alternative. You cannot plan a campaign without knowing what ships and aircraft you have. But the full strategic implications of Midway, the argument that this single battle had decisively tilted the war toward American victory, were never delivered to the political leadership in a form that would have required them to act. The assumption embedded in every planning document, every strategy briefing, every audience with the emperor, was that Japan was still in a position to achieve its war aims, that the setback was temporary, that the next operation or the one after that would restore the initiative. The language of strategic reconsideration, of fundamental reassessment, of acknowledging that the fundamental premises of the war plan had been destroyed. That language did not appear in the official record. Why not? I've been circling this question for the entire video, and now we have to land on it, because the answer is the heart of the story. The men in the Naval General Staff who understood what Midway meant faced a calculation that had nothing to do with military strategy. If they reported honestly that Japan had lost its core carrier strength, that the decisive battle plan had failed, that the industrial arithmetic now made an Allied victory essentially inevitable barring some dramatic shift in political will of the American public, if they said this plainly and formally, it meant several things simultaneously. It meant that the attack on Pearl Harbor, which they had advocated, planned, and executed, had been a catastrophic strategic mistake. It meant that the China War, which the Navy had supported alongside the Army for a decade and which had consumed enormous resources, had been the opening of a trap from which Japan could not now escape. It meant that the emperor, to whom they owed loyalty that was, in the Japanese political religious framework of the era, not merely institutional but metaphysical, had been placed in a position of grave danger by the advice and actions of his own military. In the moral universe of the Imperial Japanese military, this was not just a career-ending admission. It was a kind of cosmological transgression. It was something so enormous that the individual officer who made it was not merely professionally ruined, but was, in some sense, that their culture took very seriously, condemning his entire institution, his entire tradition, to a form of dishonor that could not be recovered from. There was also fear, plain, concrete, personal fear. The Army's military police, the Kempitai, were not in the habit of distinguishing between defeatism and treason. Officers who had spoken too clearly about Japan's strategic difficulties had, in the 1930s, been assassinated by nationalist factions within the military. The political climate in Japan in 1942 was not the 1930s exactly, but the mechanisms of intimidation remained functional. An officer who stood up in a planning meeting and said Japan has already lost the war was not making a contribution to strategic thought in any environment that officer could see around him. He was making a target of himself. And so the planning continued. The language of decisive battle was preserved. The next operation after Midway was planned as if the loss of 4 carriers was a setback from which Japan could recover, as if the operational initiative was still retrievable, as if the underlying industrial situation had not made everything that followed a question not of winning, but merely of how much damage Japan could inflict before the inevitable end. The battle that illustrated this most vividly, that made the gap between institutional language and military reality most grotesquely visible, was Guadalcanal. The American landings on Guadalcanal in August 1942 were, from Japan's perspective, a surprise. The Americans, moving faster than Japanese planners had expected, landed 11,000 Marines on the island and its neighboring Tulagi on August 7th. They captured a nearly completed Japanese airfield on the first day of fighting, renamed it Henderson Field, and immediately began improving it for their own use. By mid-August, American aircraft were flying from Henderson Field. The Japanese position on Guadalcanal was rapidly becoming untenable. The question was what to do about it. The answer the Naval General Staff developed was to reinforce the island by night, using the fast destroyers that could run down the channel the Americans would call the Slot at high speed and deliver troops and supplies under cover darkness, before American aircraft would find them at dawn. The concept had genuine tactical merit. The Japanese destroyer forces were among the most capable in the world for night fighting. The system of night reinforcement runs became known as the Tokyo Express, and it worked often enough to keep the Guadalcanal garrison alive and fighting for months longer than it might otherwise have survived. But the system could not deliver the forces required to actually retake the island, because the forces required were much larger than what destroyers could carry, and committing the transport convoys required to deliver a decisive reinforcement meant exposing those convoys to Henderson Field's aircraft during daylight. The strategic decision that was never honestly made was whether Guadalcanal was worth the cost. Holding it required a level of naval and air commitment that the Japanese could not sustain. Losing it gracefully would have meant withdrawing to a shorter defensive line and preserving naval strength for a later decisive engagement. But losing Guadalcanal gracefully would have meant acknowledging that Japan had lost the offensive initiative in the South Pacific. It would have been visible. It would have been reported. Even with the press restrictions that the Japanese government maintained, a withdrawal from a place that had been publicly described as a strategic position could not be entirely hidden. It would have required telling the political leadership that the tide had turned, and the political leadership would then have had to decide what to do about it. Better, in the institutional calculus of the Naval General Staff, to continue the fight, better to keep feeding in reinforcements, better to keep running the Tokyo Express, better to keep the question open than to force a reckoning with the answer. In the waters around Guadalcanal, in a series of night surface engagements conducted between August 1942 and February 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy demonstrated that its destroyer and cruiser forces were extraordinarily capable. At the Battle of Savo Island in August, Japanese cruisers sank for Allied heavy cruisers in one of the worst defeats in American naval history. At the Battle of Cape Esperance in October, Japanese cruisers repulsed an American force attempting to interdict the Tokyo Express. At the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November, a confused two-night engagement involving battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in a darkness lit by gun flashes and burning ships, both sides took heavy losses. Japan lost a battleship High, damaged by American fire, and then sunk by aircraft the following day. American losses included 2 Admirals, Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott, both killed on the bridge of their flagships, and 2 heavy cruisers. The night actions around Guadalcanal were, in sheer tactical terms, often demonstrations of superb Japanese seamanship and gunnery. They were also, in aggregate, a catastrophe. Because Japan was losing ships it could not replace faster than the arithmetic of replacement allowed. It was not just ships, it was men. The officers who died at Cape Esperance, at Tassavaranga, in the darkness off Guadalcanal, were officers who had spent years developing expertise in night surface warfare, who had trained their crews to a standard that no other navy could match, who carried knowledge that died with them in the water. And behind the ships and the men, always was the oil. Every night run of the Tokyo Express consumed fuel oil that Japan's tanker fleet was struggling to move from the Dutch East Indies through submarine-infested waters to the forward bases. Every carrier operation consumed aviation fuel that Japan's refining capacity could produce only in limited quantities. Every battle burned through what could not be replaced quickly enough. By February 1943, the garrison on Guadalcanal, the remnant of approximately 36,000 Japanese troops who had cycled through the island in the 6-month campaign, was in desperate condition. Malaria, dysentery, malnutrition, and American firepower had reduced the surviving force to skeletal, barely functional soldiers and sailors and aviators. The decision to evacuate was made, and the evacuation itself was a genuine tactical success. Japanese destroyers removed approximately 10,800 men from the island over 3 nights without the Americans realizing what was happening until it was almost complete. But the campaign had cost Japan approximately 25,000 dead, 2 battleships, 1 carrier, for cruisers, 11 destroyers, and roughly 700 aircraft. American losses were comparable in ships: 2 carriers, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 14 destroyers, but completely different in strategic meaning. America lost ships that its shipyards were already replacing. Japan lost ships that represented a permanent reduction in its combat capability. The evacuation was reported in Japan as a strategic withdrawal, a repositioning to more defensible lines. The families who received the standard notification letters, "Your son died in service of the Emperor," had no way to know whether their son had died of malaria, in the jungle, of starvation, on a beach, of American bombs in a transport ship attempting to run to shore, or in an air battle over the island. The letters came in the standard form, with the standard language. The country understood that Guadalcanal had been a hard fight. The country did not understand, because it was not told, that Guadalcanal represented the end of Japan's strategic offensive capability in the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto's death in April 1943 is, as I said at the beginning of this discussion, almost too symbolic to process. The Americans had broken the Japanese naval code. Not completely, not every message, but enough to read the operational communications that described as inspection tour itinerary. The message was sent in what the Japanese believed was a secure cipher. The Americans read it within hours. A mission was planned to intercept Yamamoto's transport aircraft, 18 American P-38 Lightning fighters, equipped with long-range fuel tanks, flew a circuitous 435-mile route to avoid radar detection, and arrived over Bougainville at precisely the moment Yamamoto's flight arrived. 2 transport aircraft were shot down. Yamamoto was in the first one. His body was found the next day in the jungle, still strapped into a seat, one hand gripping his sword. The man who had understood America, who had studied its industry and its people and its capacity for sustained effort, who had written the private letter saying that if Japan went to war, he could promise running wild for 6 months, but had no expectation of success after that. This man was killed by information his own institution transmitted to the enemy through complacency about communication security. It is possible to see in his death a kind of terrible coherence. The institution that killed him did not intend to kill him, but it had been killing its own best instincts, suppressing its own best analytical capacity, choosing comfortable fictions over uncomfortable truths, for so long that the carelessness that led to the compromised communication was not an aberration. It was the fruit of a culture that had decided, institution-wide, that maintaining appearances was more important than maintaining security. The Japanese announcement of Yamamoto's death was delayed for over a month while the Naval General Staff managed the public narrative. The official version eventually released described him as dying in combat operations against the enemy, which was technically accurate, while omitting every meaningful detail. The population was told to honor his sacrifice. The radio played solemn music. Military ceremonies were held at shrines across the country, and in the Naval General Staff, officers who had privately admired Yamamoto's strategic clarity, who had known that he was the best mind the Navy had for understanding the true scope of what Japan had taken on, looked at each other in their offices and said nothing, because there was nothing safe to say. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 was a moment when the strategic reality became impossible to process through the standard narrative, or should have been. Japan's new carrier force, rebuilt after Midway, with new ships and new pilots, was committed to a massive attack against the American carrier force, supporting the landings on Saipan in the Marianas. The operation was called Ago, and it was meant to be the decisive fleet engagement that Yamamoto had always sought, the battle that would destroy American carrier aviation and restore the initiative. The Japanese force comprised 9 carriers, 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, and 28 destroyers. It carried approximately 440 aircraft and their pilots. The pilots were not the pilots of 1941, the men who had attacked Pearl Harbor, who had sunk 4C, who had dominated the skies from Burma to Hawaii in the first 6 months of the war, had been consumed by the campaigns of 1942 and 1943. The pilots who flew from Japan's carriers in June 1944 were younger, less experienced, trained to lower standards by an institution that had finally acknowledged, at the individual training unit level, if not in strategy meetings, that it could not produce pilots as fast as it was losing them. The Japanese training pipeline had been compressed in the same direction as the American one, but without the industrial infrastructure to support the compression. The result was pilots who had logged far fewer flight hours, who had never seen combat, who were flying aircraft that were, by 1944, being outclassed by the new American fighters. The American fighter defending the Marianas fleet was the F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat had been designed specifically to defeat the Zero fighter that had dominated Pacific air combat in 1941 and 1942. It was faster in a dive, better protected, better armed, and flown by pilots who were, by 1944, reaching a standard training that the American system could sustain indefinitely. The Hellcat pilots of 1944 were not Yamamoto Zero pilots, but they were very good, and there were a very large number of them, and their aircraft was better. The battle that the Americans called the Marianas Turkey Shoot lasted 2 days, June 19th and 20th, 1944. On the first day, Japanese aircraft attacked in waves. American fighters, guided by radar, met them far out before they reached the American fleet. The combat air patrols tore through the Japanese formations. Of 373 Japanese aircraft that launched attacks on June 19th, approximately 243 were shot down. 3 Japanese carriers were lost. Taiho, which was Japan's newest and most modern fleet carrier, sunk by a single American submarine torpedo that caused a catastrophic internal explosion from volatile aviation fuel vapor. Shokaku, a Pearl Harbor veteran, sunk by 3 torpedo hits from another American submarine, and the light carrier Hyo, sunk by American torpedo aircraft on the second day of battle. Japan lost approximately 395 aircraft over the 2 days to America's 130. The surviving Japanese carriers had almost no aircraft left. The battle's results were reported to the Naval General Staff. The figures were clear. The losses were clear. The implication that Japan's carrier aviation, rebuilt at enormous cost after Midway, had now been effectively destroyed for the second time, and that there were neither the ships, nor the aircraft, nor the pilots to rebuild a third time before the Americans used their carrier forces to support further advances toward the Japanese home islands, was understood by every senior officer who saw the numbers. The response of the Naval General Staff was to not tell the Emperor. This is documented. The Emperor was given an account of the Philippine Sea that substantially misrepresented the losses and their implications. The men who prepared his briefings knew what had happened. They prepared a briefing that did not convey it. The Emperor, who in the institutional framework of the Japanese military bore ultimate authority for the war, and whose support was necessary for any decision to continue or end it, was kept in a condition of managed ignorance that prevented him from making an informed judgment about whether the war should continue. The kamikaze program grew from this moment, from the gap between what the Naval General Staff knew and what it was willing to acknowledge. The first organized TACO unit, the Shimpu Special Attack Corps, was formally constituted in October 1944, before the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Vice Admiral Takejiro Nishi, who organized the first unit, was a man who understood exactly what he was doing. He was not deluded about Japan's military position. He was, by the account of those who knew him, acutely aware of it. His argument for the kamikaze program was not that it would win the war. His argument was that it represented the only way to inflict enough damage on the American fleet to create the political conditions for a negotiated settlement, that the spectacle of thousands of Japanese pilots dying in this way would demonstrate a level of national resolve that the American public, in his calculation, would be unable to sustain in the face of. This argument was wrong, and at some level Nishi probably knew it was wrong, but it was the only argument available to a man who needed to find a reason to keep fighting without being able to say honestly why the fighting should continue. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was the last time the Imperial Japanese Navy operated as a coherent fighting force. It committed virtually its entire remaining surface strength, everything that could be fueled and armed and crewed, in a coordinated but ultimately incoherent four-pronged attack against the American fleet, supporting the Leyte landings in the Philippines. The battle that resulted was the largest naval engagement in history by most measures, involving hundreds of ships across an area of ocean roughly the size of France. Japan lost 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The American losses were severe: 6 carriers, 2 battleships, and a number of smaller vessels. But the American fleet retained its operational coherence and continued its operations. Japan's fleet was finished as a strategic instrument. The surviving ships lacked the fuel to operate effectively from Japanese home ports. The carrier air groups were essentially gone. The Navy that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that had sunk 4C, that had conquered an empire in 6 months, had shot its last significant bolt. The survivors of Leyte were what remained of the force, and they would fight on in the defense of Leyte and Luzon, in the kamikaze attacks that would bloody the American fleet at Lingayen Gulf and at Okinawa, in the final desperate sortie of the battleship Yamato in April 1945, sent to Okinawa on a one-way mission with fuel enough only to reach the island and with orders to beach herself and fight as a gun battery if she got there, sunk by American aircraft long before she arrived. Her 2,498 crew members dying in the East China Sea for objectives they could not have achieved even if the ship had survived. The Yamato was the largest battleship ever built. Her sinking consumed in hours what years of national resources had created. Her crew died knowing, or perhaps not allowed to fully know, that it made no military difference whatsoever. Through all of this, through Leyte Gulf, through the kamikaze campaigns, through the firebombing of Japanese cities that began in earnest in early 1945, through the destruction of Japan's merchant marine, and the consequent strangulation of its supply lines to the home islands, the institutional silence continued. The language in the Naval General Staff's planning documents continued to describe defensive operations that might create conditions for a negotiated settlement. The briefings to the Emperor continued to present Japan's situation in terms that obscured its true severity. The civilian population continued to be told, through a press apparatus that the military largely controlled, that Japan was holding firm, that the Americans were paying heavy prices, that the national spirit remained unbroken. In the actual offices of the Naval General Staff in 1945, the picture was different. Officers who had spent the previous 3 years maintaining the institutional language of strategic viability were now, in private, in the margins of their planning documents, in conversations with trusted colleagues, beginning to say what they had always known. Some were beginning to explore, through diplomatic back channels and through neutral countries like Switzerland and Sweden, whether there was any basis for negotiations with the Allies. Some were maintaining records of their doubts, documents they wrote for themselves or for history, acknowledging what they understood the trajectory to be. Some were doing nothing except waiting, because by 1945 the options had reduced themselves to two: fight to the end, or wait for someone with the authority to end it to do so. The Emperor, in early 1945, began receiving more honest counsel from some of his advisors. Former Prime Minister Konoye, in a private memorandum to the Emperor in February 1945, argued bluntly that defeat was now inevitable and that Japan's greatest danger was not defeat itself, but a communist revolution in the aftermath of defeat, driven by the suffering the war was inflicting on the civilian population. This was not exactly the argument that needed to be made, but it was an argument that could be made to this particular emperor in a framework he could accept, and it was more honest about Japan's situation than anything the military had told him. Slowly, painfully, with enormous institutional friction, the civilian leadership began to move toward a position from which peace-seeking was possible. The atomic bombs fell in this context. Hiroshima was destroyed on August 6, 1945. Nagasaki on August 9th. The Soviet Union, honoring a commitment made to the Allies at the Yalta Conference, declared war on Japan on August 8 and launched a massive offensive into Manchuria that destroyed the Guandong Army, theoretically a million-man force, in practice badly understrength and under-equipped, in a campaign of 11 days. The combination of the atomic bombings, the Soviet entry, and the growing evidence that the American bombing campaign was systematically destroying every remaining element of Japan's industrial capacity created conditions under which the emperor could override the deadlock within the military leadership and authorize surrender. The emperor's surrender announcement was recorded the night of August 14th after a coup attempt by junior officers. The Kyujo incident was suppressed by officers who remained loyal to the emperor's express wish. The coup aimed to seize the palace, prevent the broadcast of the surrender message, and continue the war. It came very close to succeeding. The officers who stopped it did so at risk of their own lives, not because they thought Japan could win, but because they believed the emperor's authority superseded the army's determination to die rather than admit defeat. The emperor's voice, when it was broadcast at noon on August 15, 1945, was heard by most Japanese people for the first time. Many could not understand his archaic court language, but the meaning became clear. The war was over. Japan had accepted the Potsdam Declaration's terms of unconditional surrender. The 14 years of Pacific expansion, the war in China, the attempt to build a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. It was over in the silence that followed the broadcast, as Japanese men and women sat in their destroyed cities and burned fields and bullet-scarred homes and processed what they had just heard. What did the Admirals think? Not all of them left records. Some killed themselves. Ritual suicide, seppuku, the final expression of the institutional culture that had governed their lives. Some sat quietly. Some wept. Some had been expecting this moment for so long that perhaps what they felt was not grief, but the strange relief of a truth that no longer had to be hidden. Yamamoto was dead, of course. He had been dead for more than 2 years, shot down over a jungle and an island that no longer mattered. His private letters, which had said so clearly before the war that he had no expectation of success, were retrieved from his correspondence and preserved. They are in archives today, and you can read them, and they have the quality of reading a man's most honest thoughts. Thoughts he was not permitted to act on, thoughts that he knew were right, thoughts that the institution he served had made it impossible for him to translate into policy. What are we supposed to do with this? What is the useful takeaway from a story about men who knew the truth and said nothing while hundreds of thousands of people died? I think the most honest answer is that there is no takeaway that makes it better. There is no lesson that is comforting. The deaths at Guadalcanal and the Philippine Sea and on the beaches of Iwo Jima and in the cities burned by American firebombing. Those deaths cannot be given meaning by a lesson learned. They are simply what happened when an institution decided, collectively and incrementally and for reasons that made sense within the institution's internal logic, that maintaining the fiction was less costly than facing the truth. What I can offer is this. The mechanisms that produce this outcome are not historically exotic. They are present in every institution where the cost of delivering unwelcome news is high enough that the people with access to unwelcome news choose, in their own rational self-interest, to deliver something else instead. They are present in every organization where the people who advance are the ones who tell leadership what leadership wants to hear, and the people who get sidelined are the ones who insist on saying what leadership doesn't. This is not a Japanese problem from 1941. This is a human problem from everywhere and always, and its symptoms, the language of optimism that no longer maps onto reality, the gap between private understanding and public statement, the cascade of decisions driven by what the institution can acknowledge rather than by what the institution actually knows. These symptoms are recognizable if you know what to look for. The admirals who said nothing were not all cowards, and they were not all villains. Some of them were men of genuine moral seriousness, trapped in a system that had been engineered over decades to make honesty too costly to choose. The tragedy is not that they were monsters. The tragedy is that they were ordinary men, men of intelligence and training and duty and loyalty, in a system that had made monstrousness the rational choice. Understanding that is not comfortable. It is supposed to be uncomfortable. Discomfort is what appropriate understanding of catastrophe feels like from the inside. If you're still with me at this point in the video, you already understand why this story matters beyond the Pacific Theater and beyond the 1940s. You understand it because you've seen at some point in your own life the same mechanism operating at a smaller scale. The meeting where everyone in the room knows the project is failing, and no one says so. The organization that promotes the optimists and sidelines the realists. The plan that everyone privately doubts but publicly endorses because the cost of descent is too high. The human mechanisms are the same. The difference is scale. The difference is that in 1941 to 1945, the institution doing the denying was running a war, and the consequences of the denial were measured in hundreds of thousands of graves. The night Japan's admirals realized they had already lost the war, that night was not in December 1941, not in June 1942, not in October 1944, when Lady Gulf ended. That night came before the first ship sailed, before the first bomb fell, before the first young man climbed into a cockpit that he would not climb out of. That night came in the quiet rooms where the numbers were done honestly, where the columns of production and manpower and fuel and time added up to an answer that was not victory. And in those rooms on that night, men who were among the most capable naval officers in the world made the choice. Not all at once, not with drama, but quietly, incrementally, decision by silence, to say nothing. That silence echoed for 4 years. It echoes still. If this video reached something in you, not just the history, but the mechanism the thing underneath the history that is still operating the world right now. Share it. Let someone else hear it. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of work. I'll see you in the next one. There's a document that almost no one outside of specialist naval history circles has read, and I want to tell you about it because it is the clearest possible evidence that the silence I've been describing was not ignorance. It was a choice. In 1941, before the war began, the Naval General Staff commissioned a set of war game exercises designed to test the Yamamoto Plan and the broader strategic situation. These exercises were conducted in September 1941 at the Naval War College in Tokyo over multiple days, with senior officers and planning staff representing both sides. The games were run with a seriousness that the Japanese naval education system brought to everything it did. They were not designed to produce a predetermined result. They were designed to identify weaknesses and risks. They were conducted by men who were genuinely trying to understand what war with the United States would look like. The results were classified at the highest possible level and were seen by a very small circle of officers. What the results showed was deeply troubling. The war games projected that in a sustained conflict against the United States, Japan would exhaust its effective naval strength within approximately 2 years, at which point American production and replacement rates would make continued Japanese naval operations increasingly costly and ultimately unsustainable. The games showed that the decisive battle strategy, the idea that one great fleet engagement could destroy American naval power and force a negotiated settlement, was extremely sensitive to timing and luck, that it depended on the American carriers being in the right place at the right time, and that there were many scenarios in which they were not. The games showed that the fuel situation was even more critical than the published estimates suggested, that actual consumption in combat operations regularly exceeded planning estimates. The games showed, in aggregate, a war that Japan could not win under most scenarios if it lasted longer than 18 months. These results were not presented to the political leadership. They were not included in the briefings given to the cabinet. They were not attached to the formal strategic assessments that went to the emperor. They were known to the officers who conducted them and to the officers who reviewed them. And those officers went to their next meetings and continued discussing the war plan in the language of achievable objectives and decisive battles. I want you to feel the enormity of that for a moment, not as an abstraction, but as a human act. Men sat in a room and watched the simulations run, and watched the simulations show Japan losing, and then walked out of the room and prepared briefings for their superiors that did not say Japan was losing. They chose to do this. It was not unconscious. It was not innocent. It was a decision made by men who understood what they were doing, in an institution that had made that decision the only rational one available. And from that decision, from that specific, concrete choice to walk out of the war game room and say nothing, everything else followed. The formal declaration of war was presented to the American government on December 7, 1941, in Washington. Though through a series of bureaucratic failures in the Japanese embassy, it was delivered more than an hour after the attack on Pearl Harbor began. The delay was unintentional. The lengthy diplomatic cable from Tokyo had to be decoded and retyped, and the embassy staff worked slowly enough that the timing slipped. But the fact that Japan had attacked while formally at peace, that the declaration arrived after the bombs were already falling, shaped American public perception of the war in a way that had real strategic consequences. The phrase sneak attack entered the American vocabulary that day and never left it. The sense of outrage, of violated norms, of a treacherous enemy that attacked without warning, fused with the grief of the attack's casualties to produce a war fever in the American public that the Japanese Navy's political analysts, when they considered the question, had hoped to avoid. Yamamoto had wanted the declaration delivered before the attack. The embassy's slowness had turned a deliberate attack into a perceived act of treachery, and that perception would sustain American public support for the war at exactly the level that Japan's strategic assumptions had hoped would not materialize. The weeks after Pearl Harbor produced something else that the Japanese planners had not adequately anticipated. They unified a deeply divided American public. The United States in late 1941 was a country genuinely divided over whether to enter the European War. The isolationist movement was powerful, well-organized, and enjoyed significant public support. Figures like Charles Lindbergh argued persuasively that America's interests were best served by staying out of the European conflict. The debate was passionate. sometimes bitter and genuinely uncertain in its outcome. Pearl Harbor ended that debate in a morning. The isolationist movement collapsed within hours of the attack, as its prominent members issued statements supporting the war effort. The division that Japan had counted on, the American political fracture that they hoped would prevent a sustained commitment to Pacific War, was healed by the attack itself. Japan had, in attacking Pearl Harbor, solved one of America's most significant political problems. The Japanese planners who had considered the American will question had generally argued that America was a democracy, that democracies were susceptible to public pressure against costly wars, that the American people would not sustain the sacrifices required to fight a prolonged Pacific war across thousands of miles of ocean. This analysis was not entirely without foundation. It was based on real observations about how democratic public opinion functions. But it missed something critical about American political culture, something that Yamamoto himself understood from his years in the United States. Americans did not respond to attack by asking whether the cause was worth the cost. They responded by asking how to win. The political logic of democratic reluctance that Japan was counting on applied in a country choosing to enter a war. It did not apply in a country that had been attacked. Once the bombs fell at Pearl Harbor, the question of whether America would fight was settled. The only question was how long and how hard. This was another thing that was known, or should have been known. In Tokyo, the American response to being attacked, historically and culturally, was not accommodation. Japan had just activated the largest industrial economy in history in the cause of its own destruction, and the men in the Naval General Staff who understood America well enough knew exactly what that meant. Let me take you now into the interior life of a specific man, because I think it makes what I've been describing more real than any strategic analysis can. His name is Minoru Genda, and he was one of the most brilliant aviation planners in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was Yamamoto's primary planner for the Pearl Harbor operation. He designed the tactical details of the attack, the combination of torpedo planes and dive bombers and high-level bombers, the formation tactics, the target prioritization. He was, in the autumn of 1941, arguably the most important operational planner in the Japanese Navy. Genda was also not naive. He understood what he was planning in the context of what it would and would not achieve. He understood that destroying the battleships at Pearl Harbor, while tactically significant, did not destroy American industrial capacity. He understood that the carriers were the critical targets, and that if the carriers were not present, the operation's strategic value was severely limited. He had arguments with other planners about the target list, about whether to include a third strike wave to hit the fuel and repair facilities. He lost some of those arguments. The third wave was not sent. The fuel tank survived, and Genda, who was present during the operation aboard one of the carriers, who received the after-action reports with the same information as everyone else, went back to his work. After Midway, Genda threw himself into the task of rebuilding Japan's carrier aviation. He worked with extraordinary energy on the training programs, on the aircraft development programs, on the tactics that the new air groups would use. He was not a man who gave up. He was not a man who stopped working when the situation became difficult. But the record also shows that he did not produce, in 1942 or 1943, or any subsequent year, a formal strategic assessment arguing that Japan's situation was hopeless and that the war should be ended. He kept working within the system. He kept doing the next thing the system required. The broader question, the question that transcended any particular operation or training program or aircraft specification, was not a question that the system permitted him to ask, and he did not ask it. This is what I mean when I say the silence was institutional rather than individual. It was not that each officer sat down and consciously decided to lie. It was that the system had structured the decision space in a way that made certain questions unaskable and certain answers invisible. The men inside it were not stupid. They were, in many ways, exceptionally capable. They simply inhabited a structure that routed their capability away from the question that actually mattered and toward the endless cascade of operational questions that kept them busy and productive and, in the institution's terms, useful. The capacity for strategic honesty had been engineered out of the system over years, not through any single act of censorship, but through the accumulated weight of every promotion that rewarded optimism, every meeting that punished doubt, every briefing that shaped its information to match what the recipients wanted to hear. The Battle of Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942 is worth a moment of attention because it demonstrates something about the way Japan experiences victories. At Santa Cruz, Japanese carrier aircraft attacked the American carriers Hornet and Enterprise. They sank the Hornet and damaged the Enterprise badly enough that she was the only American carrier in the South Pacific capable of operations for several weeks after battle. Japan's own carriers were damaged but survived. By the ship-sunk metric, it was a Japanese victory, and at the operational level, the Japanese carrier air groups had demonstrated again that they were capable of attacking effectively and hitting their targets. But the Japanese air groups had also taken catastrophic losses in experienced pilots. Squadron leaders, section leaders, men who had been flying combat for 2 years, men whose experience was essentially irreplaceable. They died over the waters of the Santa Cruz Islands in numbers that alarmed the carrier group commanders who counted them afterward. Japan had won the battle and lost something more important than ships. The carrier group commanders wrote this down. They reported the pilot losses. They noted the quality gap between what had been lost and what the training pipeline would deliver to replace them. The reports went to the Naval General Staff. The Naval General Staff acknowledged them. The loss rates were factored into planning estimates, but the planning estimates continued to project decisive fleet engagements that Japan would win, because those projections were what the planning estimates were required to project. The honest analysis and the official analysis existed simultaneously and never converged, because convergence would have required the official analysis to say what the honest analysis said, which was that Japan was running out of the kind of men it needed and could not run them back in. Admiral Takagi Sokichi was one of the few men inside the system who tried to bring the honest analysis into the official record. Takagi was a naval strategist assigned to an intelligence function that gave him access to Japan's true resource and production situation. Over the course of 1942 and 1943, he compiled an assessment of Japan's strategic position that was, by the standards of what the Naval General Staff was producing officially, brutally frank. His analysis showed that Japan's fuel supplies were inadequate to sustain the pace of operations being conducted. It showed that ship losses were exceeding replacement rates. It showed that the aircraft production differential with the United States was widening rather than narrowing. It showed, in aggregate, that Japan had already passed the point at which the war could be won in any conventional military sense, and was now in a war it could only extend, not conclude favorably. Takagi circulated his analysis to senior officers. Some of them read it. Some of them agreed with it privately. None of them acted on it in ways that changed the institutional direction. The analysis existed in the record. It did not change the briefings. It did not change the strategy meetings. It did not reach the emperor. It sat in the documentary record like a message that was sent and received and understood, and then ignored, because ignoring it was the institutional default, and acting on it was the institutional impossibility. There was a moment in November 1943 when the gap between institutional language and reality became briefly, painfully, almost publicly visible. The American assault on Tarawa and the Gilbert Islands demonstrated, at terrible cost of Marines who made the assault, that American amphibious capabilities had reached a level of competence that could overcome even prepared island defenses. Tarawa was a coral atoll whose Japanese garrison had built extensive fortifications, and it was taken anyway in 76 hours at the cost of nearly 1,000 American dead. The tactical lesson that the Americans absorbed from Tarawa, that their preliminary bombardment procedures needed to be improved, that their landing craft needed to be better protected, that coordination between fire support and landing forces needed refinement, was absorbed and implemented in subsequent operations. The strategic lesson that Japan should have absorbed, that the outer perimeter was not holdable against this level of American commitment and capability, was not formally absorbed because the institution could not absorb it without saying something it was not allowed to say. The Marshals fell in February 1944. The Americans bypassed the heavily fortified centers of Truk and Rabaul, leaving their garrisons to wither in isolation, and went straight for the targets that mattered. In April 1944, American carrier aircraft struck the Palau Islands with devastating effect. In June came Saipan, and with Saipan the loss of the Marianas. And with the loss of the Marianas came the revelation that was still being managed in Tokyo's briefing rooms. American B-29 bombers flying from Saipan and Tinian could reach the Japanese home islands. The fall of Saipan led to the fall of the government. Prime Minister Tojo, who had led Japan since October 1941, and whose political fortunes were inseparable from the war's progress, was forced to resign on July 18, 1944. His departure was, in the language of the Japanese political system, framed as a government reorganization. In the language of any other political system, it was an acknowledgement that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The men who replaced him were men who were beginning, slowly, to ask the question that should have been asked in 1942. Was there a way out? The answer to that question was complicated by the Allies' demand for unconditional surrender, announced at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943 and never formally modified. The Japanese leadership, including the peace faction, could not accept unconditional surrender in the terms the Allies stated, because unconditional surrender implied the possibility of the abolition of the imperial institution, the trial of the emperor as a war criminal, the dismantling of everything that Japanese national identity, in its modern form, had been built around. This was not merely political difficulty for the men making the decisions. It was a genuine belief, sincere, not cynical, that the survival of the imperial institution was a precondition for anything that could follow. Without the emperor, there was no Japan that they could surrender on behalf of. The institution that had prevented honest assessment of the war's progress had also made it impossible to face honestly the terms on which the war might end. The American campaign of firebombing Japanese cities, which began in earnest with the March 9 to 10, 1945 raid on Tokyo that killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night, more deaths than either atomic bomb would produce, was the industrial application of what Japan's admirals had always known was coming. The industrial capacity that Yamamoto had watched being assembled in the United States in the 1920s had been applied, after 4 years of mobilization, to the systematic destruction of Japanese cities. The B-29s flew from bases that the American carrier forces had made possible. The bombers that burned Tokyo were protected by fighters flying from carriers whose construction had been underway before Pearl Harbor was attacked. The entire weight of the American industrial economy, the steel mills and the automobile plants and the oil fields and the machine tool factories and the training airfields, the entire enormous system that Yamamoto had observed rolling across the continent by rail, had been converted into a machine for destroying Japan, and it was operating at full capacity. In the Naval General Staff in the spring of 1945, there were men who came to work every morning and processed intelligence reports about the previous night's bombing and the current status of the fleet and the supply situation, and then attended meetings in which the language remained the language of resistance and decisive battle and national will. The dissonance must have been almost impossible to sustain, and some of them were not sustaining it. Some of them were working back channels through neutral countries. Some of them were writing private assessments. Some of them were simply waiting, doing their work, hoping that someone with more authority than they had would find a way to end it. The peace feelers that Japan sent to the Soviet Union in 1945, asking Moscow to mediate a negotiated settlement, were naive about Soviet intentions to a degree that is almost painful to observe. Stalin had already committed at Yalta to entering the Pacific War against Japan, and Soviet diplomats maintained their contact with Japanese peace overtures while preparing the offensive that would drive through Manchuria in August. But the Japanese attempt to use the Soviets as mediators was not irrational given the information the peace faction had. It was the best available option for a leadership that could not approach the Americans directly without being overthrown by the army. The Naval General Staff watched these diplomatic efforts proceed with varying degrees of engagement, some officers supportive, some opposed, most simply continuing with the operational planning that the Army was insisting on regardless. The operational planning for Operation Ketsugo, the defense of Japanese home islands against anticipated American invasion, proceeded on the assumption that Japan could inflict casualties severe enough in defense to force the Americans to accept negotiated terms rather than continue the invasion. The estimate of American invasion casualties prepared by Japanese planners, which reach American hands through various channels and help shape the debate over whether to use the atomic bomb, projected losses in the hundreds of thousands of American dead in the first phase of the invasion alone. These projections were not entirely fabricated. They were based on the kamikaze resources being assembled, the ground forces being positioned, the fortification work underway on Kyushu, But they were projections made in the same institutional context that had produced every other planning document. They were designed to support a predetermined conclusion, not to honestly assess an uncertain outcome. The atomic bombs bypassed all of this. They bypassed the institutional machinery that had suppressed honest analysis for 4 years. They bypassed the planning bureaucracy and the briefing filters and the language conventions. They delivered, in 2 flashes of light over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a physical fact about American technological capacity and political will that could not be filtered through any institutional frame. They demonstrated that America possessed a weapon of a categorically different order than anything in the existing technological repertoire, and they demonstrated that America was willing to use it, and they demonstrated that the defense of the home islands would not produce the cost-imposing attrition that Ketsugo assumed. Because a single aircraft could destroy a city, the entire strategic calculation of the final defense collapsed in the face of a technology that the planners had not anticipated and could not account for. What the bombs gave the emperor was a way out that the institutional culture could accommodate. Surrender to human military force, in the framework of Japanese military ideology, was degradation. Surrender in the face of divine wind of destruction. The atomic bombs were, in the framing that the emperor used in his surrender announcement, a cruel new bomb of destructive power, such as the world had never before encountered, was different. It was not defeat in battle. It was a recognition of a force beyond human contest. This framing was constructed in the 48 hours between the Nagasaki bomb and the surrender broadcast, and it was constructed deliberately to make the surrender possible within the cultural and political framework of Imperial Japan. The framing was, in some ways, as much a management of institutional reality as anything the Naval General Staff had ever done. But this time, the management was in service of ending the killing rather than continuing it. The broadcast itself was strange and brief, less than 5 minutes. The Emperor's voice had a quality that no one had ever heard. High, slightly trembling, archaic in its vocabulary, completely different from anything the Japanese public had been told to expect from the living God who had been the symbolic center of their war. He did not use the word surrender. He said Japan was accepting the terms of the joint declaration. He said the war had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. That phrase, not necessarily to Japan's advantage, has become one of the most famous euphemisms in the history of recorded speech, a monument to the distance between official language and actual reality that had governed Japan's conduct of the entire war. The war had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. For years, 3 million Japanese dead, dozens of cities burned, the fleet sunk, the Air Force destroyed, the merchant marine gone. The cities of a nation turned to ash, not necessarily to Japan's advantage. And in that phrase, if you listen for it, you can hear everything I've been trying to tell you. You can hear the Naval General Staff and its briefings and its filtered intelligence and its managed truth. You can hear the war game results that were never shared. You can hear Yamamoto's private letter about 6 months and no expectation of success. You can hear every planning document that said decisive battle instead of inevitable defeat. You can hear the survivors of Midway, who were quarantined from their families, so they couldn't say what happened. You can hear the 4 years of silence made into 5 words, not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The truth had been there from the beginning. It had been known to the men who made the decisions. It had been suppressed by a system that made honesty dangerous and denial rational. And the distance between what was known and what was said, measuring the bodies of the men and women and children who died during those 4 years, is the real subject of this video. Not the battles, not the strategy, not the admirals. The distance, that distance is not unique to Japan. It is not unique to 1941. It exists in every organization, every institution, every system where the cost of telling the truth exceeds the cost of maintaining the fiction. It exists in quiet offices and conference rooms and planning meetings and performance reviews and budget presentations. Everywhere that people with knowledge of an unwelcome reality make the calculation, consciously or not, that the unwelcome reality is better kept to themselves. The scale changes. The consequences change. The mechanism does not. Learning to recognize that mechanism in the institutions you work within, in the information you receive, in the reports that cross your desk, and the briefings you attend, and the language that gets used when things are not going well, is not a historical exercise. It is a survival skill. It is what the admirals of the Imperial Japanese Navy failed at, or were prevented from practicing, or were never allowed to develop in the years that led from the war game room in Tokyo in September 1941 to the broadcast from the palace on August 15th, 1945. They knew, they had always known, and the silence that followed that knowledge in all its catastrophic consequence is a warning that travels through history with perfect clarity. If you are willing to listen, share this video if it found you, subscribe if you want more. I'll see you in the next one. To truly understand the silence, you have to spend some time inside the physical space where it was maintained. The Naval General Staff occupied a large building in Tokyo, and within that building, the men who planned and directed the war spent their days in a rhythm of meetings, intelligence briefings, operational reviews, and communications with fleet commanders spread across the Pacific. The building was organized in a way that military bureaucracies everywhere are organized, hierarchically, with information flowing upward in process form and orders flowing downward with assumed authority. The physical architecture of the place reinforced the social architecture. Information was filtered as it moved upward, stripped of qualifications and uncertainties, shaped into the language that the recipients were accustomed to receiving. Junior officers who prepared briefing materials did not present raw intelligence to their superiors. They synthesized it. The synthesis process, the conversion of raw, often contradictory, frequently alarming intelligence data into the clean charts and summary assessments that senior officers reviewed, was where the silence was manufactured day by day and briefing by briefing. A junior officer who received a report from an intelligence unit noting that American aircraft production had increased by 30% in the previous quarter had to decide how to present this fact in a summary document that would be reviewed by an admiral who was planning an offensive operation. The admiral needed to plan the operation. The operation was already approved at the highest level. The 30% production increase was a fact that existed in tension with the operation's assumptions. What did the junior officer do? Most of the time, he contextualized it. He noted the increase, but placed it within a framework that did not require the admiral to revise his assumptions. He did this not because he was dishonest, or not only because he was dishonest, but because the institutional reward structure had, over years and through hundreds of small decisions, taught everyone in the building that this was how briefings were prepared. The men at the very top of the Naval General Staff, men like Admiral Osemi Nagano, the chief of the Naval General Staff from 1941 to 1944, received information that had passed through multiple layers of this synthesis process. By the time a strategic assessment reached Nagano's desk, it had been processed enough times that the original alarming raw data it was based on was invisible within the carefully calibrated language of the document's conclusions. Nagano was not ignorant. He received enough fragments of the real picture to understand, intellectually, that the war was not going well. But intellectual understanding filtered through the institutional language was different from confronting the raw numbers, and Nagano, like every admiral of his generation, had been trained to trust the institutional process over his own unmediated reactions. He trusted the system. The system had been designed to tell him something other than the truth. Below the level of the Naval General Staff, in the fleet commands and the base commands, and the air group headquarters scattered across the Pacific, there were men who saw the truth without any filtering at all. The torpedo boat commander running the Tokyo Express down the slot to Guadalcanal on his 15th run knew what he was doing. He knew that his destroyers were transporting not the reinforcements that could retake the island, but the minimum supplies required to prevent the garrison from starving before the next run. He knew this because he counted the bags of rice and the boxes of ammunition being loaded onto his ships, and he knew they were not enough. He ran the slot anyway, because those were his orders, because his country was at war, because the men on the island were dying, and whatever he could bring them was better than nothing. His reports went back up the chain of command, where they were processed through the synthesis system and converted into language about the continuing resupply effort and the maintenance of the forward position. The men who flew the fighters from Henderson Field's perimeter, the Army Air Corps pilots assigned to intercept the Tokyo Express bombers and the Japanese air raids, watched the Japanese aircraft coming day after day, and noted the quality of the pilots declining over the months of the Guadalcanal campaign. In August and September 1942, the Japanese pilots they faced were skilled, aggressive, and dangerous. By November and December, The pilots were noticeably less experienced, their formation flying less precise, their maneuvering less instinctive. The American pilots discussed this in their debriefs. They reported it, the observation that Japanese pilot quality was declining, that the replacement pool was shallower than the original pool, was absorbed into the American intelligence system. On the Japanese side, the same decline was being observed by Japanese air group commanders, who reported it up the same chain that processed reports into the language of operational planning. The fuel problem deserves more time than I've given it, because it was perhaps the most immediately concrete expression of the strategic impossibility that Japan's leadership could not acknowledge. Japan's military fuel consumption in 1941 was approximately 3.5 million tons of oil per year. Japan's domestic oil production was approximately 400,000 tons. The rest came from imports, primarily from the United States and from the Dutch East Indies. When the American embargo cut off American oil in July 1941, Japan's planners calculated that existing reserves would last approximately 18 months. The seizure of the Dutch East Indies oil fields was therefore not optional. It was an immediate operational necessity if the war was to be prosecuted for more than a year and a half. Japan seized the oil fields, but getting the oil from the Dutch East Indies to the Japanese home islands and then to the operational fleet required a tanker fleet operating across thousands of miles of increasingly submarine-infested waters. American submarines, which were plagued with torpedo problems in the war's first year, gradually solved those problems through a combination of engineering fixes and operational experience. And by 1943 and 1944, they were conducting one of the most effective submarine campaigns in naval history. Japanese shipping losses to submarines in 1942 were approximately 630,000 tons. In 1943, they rose to 1.5 million tons. In 1944, they rose further to 3.9 million tons. Japan's entire merchant fleet, which had started the war at approximately 6 million tons, was being reduced to a level at which the supply lines to the outer perimeter and eventually to the home islands themselves became unsustainable. The oil was in the ground in Sumatra and Java. Getting it to Yokosuka or Kure required tankers that were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. By 1944, Japanese naval warships were being forced to base in the oil production areas themselves, at Linggar roads near Singapore, close to the Sumatra oil fields, rather than at their home ports, because sailing back to Japan for fuel was no longer operationally feasible. The fleet had, in a very literal sense, been cut off from its home by the destruction of its supply lines. Warships based at Linggar roads could not be adequately maintained because the repair facilities there were nowhere near as capable as the dry docks at Kure and Yokosuka. They trained in degraded conditions. Their crews were separated from the shore infrastructure of the home ports, and the fuel they were living on was a fuel that hadn't yet been sunk in transit, which meant there was always a question of how long the supply would hold. The Navy's fuel situation was shared with the Army, who had their own insatiable consumption, and with the civilian economy, which had been placed under increasingly severe rationing. By late 1944, the average Japanese civilian was living on a fraction of the fuel allocation they had received before the war. Industries that had not been directly converted to war production were going dark for lack of power and raw materials. The transportation system that moved food and industrial goods around the home islands was beginning to seize up as fuel allocations were cut. Japan was, in a very real sense, being strangled from without while it continued to fight from within. In the Naval General Staff's logistics offices, officers tracked these numbers daily. The tanker loss reports came in. The production reports came in. The allocation requests from the fleet came in, always exceeding what was available. Officers made decisions about who got oil and who didn't, knowing that the decisions they were making were life or death decisions for operations that were themselves life or death for the men prosecuting them. These officers were not uninformed about Japan's situation. They were perhaps the most informed people in the country about it, in one specific and critical dimension. And they came to work every day and processed the numbers and prepared their allocation tables and went home without having told anyone in the political leadership that the oil situation alone made a favorable outcome of the war impossible. The story of the destroyer Yukikes is almost too emblematic to include without apology for the obviousness of its symbolism, but history doesn't apologize for its symbols. So here it is. The Yukikes was a Cadro-class destroyer that served throughout the Pacific War, from Pearl Harbor to the final days. She fought at every major naval engagement in the South Pacific, at Guadalcanal, at the Philippine Sea, at Leyte Gulf, and on the final voyage of the Yamato, which she survived when the battleship did not. She was called a ship that cannot be sunk, and she earned that name by surviving engagements that killed every other ship in her formation. By the war's end, she was one of the very few large Japanese warships still afloat and operational, and she was returned to China as war reparations and served in the Republic of China Navy until 1970. The Yukike's survival was remarkable and largely the product of circumstance and the skill of her successive captains. But what she represented by the war's end, one destroyer among the hundreds of ships that had been sunk, the last survivor of formation after formation that had been destroyed, was a concentrated embodiment of what the Naval General Staff silence had produced. Ship by ship, formation by formation, the fleet had been consumed. The men who knew this would happen, who had run the numbers before the war and during it, who had understood at every step what the trajectory was. They had kept working, kept planning, kept fighting, and kept saying nothing that the institution could not absorb. And the Yukikes floated alone in the harbor at Sasebo, and the war was over, and the silence finally ended. There were Japanese naval officers who did, in the end, try to say something. Some of them waited until after the war to write their memoirs and their histories. When the institutional constraints that had silenced them were gone and the physical danger of honesty had passed. What they wrote is instructive precisely because it is so careful, so hedged, so careful to assign blame in ways that protected the institution even in retrospect. They wrote about mistakes in specific operations. They wrote about failures of communications or failures of intelligence. They wrote about the unforeseeable elements of individual battles. Very few of them wrote what many of them clearly knew, that the war had been unwinnable from the start, that the institutional culture that had brought Japan to war had made honest assessment impossible, and that the hundreds of thousands of men who died had been failed not by the courage of their fighting forces, but by the intellectual cowardice of the institutions that sent them to fight. The exception, the voice that speaks most directly, is Yamamoto's own correspondence, recovered after the war from the people he had sent his private letters to. In those letters, written across the 1930s and into the opening of the war, you can hear a man who saw clearly and spoke clearly in private and operated in a zone of required silence in public. The letters are not confessional documents. They were not written as a record of protest or a testament for posterity. They were letters to friends, written in the confidence of private communication, in a language stripped of the official formulas. And in them, Yamamoto sounds like a man who understood what he was part of, who found it deeply uncomfortable, who could see no exit that a sense of institutional loyalty permitted him to take, and who executed his duty with all the skill at his disposal, while privately knowing that the duty was in service of a catastrophe. He deserves some compassion, as do most of the men in this story. They were not cartoons of militaristic pride. They were men caught between their professional judgments and the institutional culture that shaped every incentive around them. Some of them, in their private lives, were men of culture and learning and sensitivity. Some of them loved their families. Some of them were capable of genuine moral reflection. None of this saved them or their country from the consequences of the collective choice to maintain the silence. The compassion and the judgment are not mutually exclusive. The tragedy and the moral failure are both true at once. That, finally, is what I want you to take from this. Not the satisfaction of judging the Japanese admirals from the safety of 80 years' distance. Not the comfortable feeling that you would have done differently. The actual takeaway is harder than that. The actual takeaway is that the mechanisms that produce this silence, the institutional dynamics, the reward structures, the language of qualified optimism, the cost of honesty, the career calculations, the gap between private understanding and public statement. These are not exotic features of foreign military from the distant past. They are features of how institutions work. They are present in modern organizations. They are operating right now in places you can probably name, producing silences of their own. The scale is different. The consequences of silences operating in most modern institutions are not measured in hundreds of thousands of graves, but the mechanism is the same. And recognizing the mechanism is the only meaningful memorial to the men who died because the people who knew the truth said nothing. That is the story. That is the night the Admirals realized they had already lost and chose silence over truth and paid for that choice in the bodies of their own people. If this reached you, share it. Subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next one. The quarantine of the Midway survivors is a detail I keep returning to because it is the moment where the institutional silence becomes most visibly, most literally human after the battle. As the surviving ships of the striking force turned northwest toward Japan, the crews of the four sunk carriers had been rescued from the ocean and distributed among destroyers and surviving ships. These men, aviators, mechanics, officers, seamen, had watched their ships burn and sink. They had floated in oil-slicked water. They had been pulled from the Pacific with whatever they were wearing when they jumped or were thrown from ships. They were, in the physical sense, alive. They were carrying, in the psychological sense, one of the most important pieces of strategic information that Japan's leadership needed to have. When the ships arrived back in Japan, the Midway survivors were not permitted to disembark into the normal flow of sailors returning from a deployment. They were met by naval officers who directed them to specific facilities, away from the main port areas, away from the commercial districts and the train stations where a sailor in transit might encounter a civilian and exchange a few words. They were billeted in naval barracks that were not the usual facilities, in locations that were more isolated than normal. Their mail was monitored. Their movements were restricted. Some were told, explicitly, that they were not to speak to civilians about where they had been or what had happened. Some were not told explicitly. They absorbed the instruction from the atmosphere of managed silence around them, from the way the receiving officers avoided certain questions, from the care with which their handlers ensured that the word Midway and the word carriers and the word defeat were not spoken in any context where a civilian ear might receive them. These men lived in this condition for months, some for the rest of the war, because they were reabsorbed into fleet before the war's end, and their personal histories were simply subsumed back into the ongoing catastrophe. But in those first months after Midway, they occupied a peculiar liminal space. They were men whose experience had given them knowledge that their own country could not afford to acknowledge, and so they were suspended in administrative silence, held in place by an institution that had decided that what they knew was too dangerous to let loose into the world. What did they feel? The records, such as they are, suggest a range that encompasses shock, grief, anger, shame, and a dull institutional obedience that comes from years of military training. Some accounts suggest that some of the men were not told directly, even by each other, what the full scale of the defeat had been. Individual sailors who had served on Soria did not necessarily know the Akagi had also sunk, and vice versa, because the rescue and redistribution of survivors had been chaotic, and because the institutional management of information had reached down even to the level of conversations among shipmates. The defeat was experienced in fragments, each man knowing only his piece, with no official voice assembling the pieces in a whole that would have made the meaning undeniable. This fragmentation was not accidental. It was a feature of how the silence was maintained. No single person below the level of fleet command had access to all the information, and the fleet commanders were themselves operating within the constraints of what the Naval General Staff was willing to record officially. The silence was distributed, parceled out, shared in pieces small enough that no individual piece was sufficient to demand a response. It was, in its own terrible way, a sophisticated piece of information management, accomplished not through elaborate censorship machinery, but through the simple, low-tech method of keeping people apart from each other and letting the isolation do the work. I think about those men sometimes, sitting in their restricted barracks in the summer of 1942, knowing what they knew, saying nothing, waiting for an institutional purpose that was not coming from most of them. They had served their country with extraordinary courage. The carrier crews of the striking force were among the finest naval personnel in the world, and they had done their jobs well and fought hard and lost through a combination of bad luck and circumstances beyond their control. They deserved to be received with the full weight of their country's grief and honor. Instead, they were quarantined because the information they carried was politically inconvenient, the silence that the Admirals maintained at the strategic level required. as a supporting structure, the silence of the men who had actually been there. The lie at the top required lies all the way down. This is the mechanism, fully visible. The gap between what is known and what is said requires not just the cooperation of the leaders who know, but the enforced silence of the people through whom the truth might otherwise reach the world. It requires quarantine. It requires monitored mail. It requires restricted movements. It requires the careful management of every channel through which the real story might escape. And every measure required to maintain the silence is a measure that uses human beings as instruments of institutional self-protection rather than as the people they actually are. The Midway survivors were not the last people to be managed this way. The pattern repeated across the war. The careful control of casualty notifications that omitted cause of death, the management of repatriated prisoners whose accounts of conditions in the prisoner of war camps were politically inconvenient, the soldiers returned from Guadalcanal who were kept away from the civilian population, while the official story of a strategic redeployment was consolidated at every level and in every theater. The silence required infrastructure, and the infrastructure required human cooperation, and the human cooperation was obtained through the same mechanisms. Authority, fear, duty, and the cultural conviction that maintaining the institution's face was a form of loyalty rather than its betrayal. The men who maintained that silence were not, most of them, enthusiasts for deception. They were men who had been formed by an institution that told them this was how things were done, and they did it. And the costs accumulated, and the war continued, and the silence held until it didn't. Understanding this is not absolution for the choices made. It is rather the only honest accounting of how the mechanism works. Not through villains who love deception, but through ordinary people who have been trained to manage information in ways that serve the institution over the truth, who experience this management not as deception, but as duty, and who carry that experience with them through careers and lives without ever fully confronting what it cost. The night Japan's admirals realized they had already lost the war was every night of the war. It was the night before Pearl Harbor and the night after Midway and the night after the Philippine Sea, and every night in between when the numbers in the reports and the numbers in the briefings refused to add up to the same total. The realization was not a single moment. It was sustained, continuous, daily experience, managed through sustained, continuous, daily choices to say something other than what was known. That is the night I've been trying to describe. Not a date, a condition, a way of inhabiting knowledge without acting on it, a way of carrying the truth through years of consequence without letting it out. It ended on August 15th, 1945, with a voice on the radio that most of its listeners had never heard before, saying words that most of them could barely understand, acknowledging what had been known for years, and said for none of them, the silence broke, the war ended, and everything it had cost had already been paid.